Commence primary ignition.
I'm just not the hero type, clearly.
What a piece of junk.
Enterprise, this is the captain.
I got a bad feeling about this.
It's all part of the plan.
Engage.
Welcome back to Podcast 2 for 1. I'm your host, Donovan Thompson, with my co-host,
Daniel Wingfield.
and we are back again today with none other than Dr. Bruce Hutchinson.
Great to be back once again.
Once again, and we
Yes.
are on the road to episode 100. This is episode 99, and we are celebrating by breaking down Avengers Infinity War in a two-part special. So the next episode releasing after this will be episode 100 to celebrate our 2-year anniversary doing the podcast. It's a lot of episodes, and Bruce, I think you've been on quite a few of them.
I'm happy to be here. And also, I just had to say 99 podcasts and 241 ain't one.
Mm-hmm.
I like it.
I'm just gonna let that pass without comment.
Yeah, no, that was good. But no,
I like it.
I'm trying to sabotage.
I like where your head
back,
was at,
so,
though. I like where your head was at.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was trying to do something in the spur of the moment when you said 99. I was like, okay.
You need to make a whole rap song for episode 241, and we'll let you sing it at the beginning. We'll let you do that.
Perfect. Yes.
Like, I got a
Yes.
couple of
Yes.
years, hopefully, before we get to that.
Exactly.
But no, it's been super fun being a regular guest on your podcast, and I always love our discussions. So
That's
thanks
awesome.
for
Me
keep
too.
inviting me back.
Yeah, of course.
Love it.
Well, we're on the cusp of 2021. We've had a lot of MCU this year, and one thing I've been really wanting to do is go back and look at Infinity War, not only because it's probably my favorite, one of my favorite movies of all time. I saw it 7 times in theaters, which is my current record. I just think it's a really tight movie. I think it's a fun celebration of the MCU, and I think it could be interesting to talk about for a number of different reasons. So I'd kind of like to start with you guys and tell me what you think about the movie and what's your general impressions coming out of it and then rewatching it here lately.
So I watched it. I was very technical in my watching of it. So this is probably, I watched it in the theater. I probably watched it once or twice on video before now. And so, with an opportunity to break down a movie like this, I really wasn't thinking about it in terms of the quality of the movie so much in terms of emotional engagement and stuff like that. I was more thinking about really just understanding kind of how a movie like this works. It is sort of interesting. In some ways it is more simple than it appears. Editing and putting together a movie like this with this many characters and this many moving parts, I think is challenging. And so it is impressive kind of what they've done. I also not that I really needed to do this kind of analysis to really figure some of these things out, but it was interesting seeing maybe some of the, I don't know if I want to call them problems, but just things that surprised me a little bit. So for example, and we'll get into it, but Thor's part is really kind of lame in this movie. When you dig in, his whole thing is to go get a new hammer, and he's off on a side mission almost the entire time. So it was kind of interesting to see how some of those things played out and kind of characters that were bigger. And then, the way who are the main characters of this movie, because there are so many, and it's not like, let's say, the first Avengers movie where even though you've got an ensemble, Tony is kind of the leader, and in some ways he's a bit of the protagonist. Here, I don't think you can make that argument. There's just too many characters, but figuring out kind of who the key characters are, which in my mind seems primarily to be Gamora and Vision. But then again, there's other places where other characters are more important. So that was really interesting. And so I'm looking forward to talking about it. So like I said, I think I was more technical with it than just, does this hold up quality wise?
Sure. No, and that's what I want from you too. Daniel?
Yeah, you're giving us what we're paying you for.
Oh, I see. That's the expectations. Okay. I'm just going to relax then.
I love this movie. I think, coming into it, I remember, we were coming off Doctor Strange and Thor Ragnarok, which I liked, but my MCU fatigue was at, a moderate level going into this movie. I was, hyped, but not like sold that I was going to just love it. And I was honestly, I was worried about them juggling this many stars, in a film and in a narrative. And I remember coming out of it just being like, not only did they do it, but they did it better than I thought they possibly could have done it. And I think there's a couple reasons for that, but I think, for me, this is almost more of Thanos' movie. And in some ways, I think you could argue potentially for him being somewhat of a protagonist. I think there's a certain point of view where you could take
I should have said that to you. 100%
that Thanos
right,
is more of a protagonist here, and that even when we're with other characters, we're consumed with Thanos' goals and his goals his goals drive the movie, and his goals are what the movie's about. And I think that almost is something you can't do unless you are the MCU, unless you have 20 movies or was it
You're
more
right.
than 20 movies preceding this? But yeah, I think this movie it does something that I think only a movie of this type built on 20 years of movies can do. You know what I mean? And I think there's something really cool about that. And yeah, we'll talk about it more. But yeah, I love this movie a lot.
Yeah, I sat down today and had my iPad out, and like every scene change, I'd write the time down. I actually did my homework on this one because I was really curious. Because
you mean you don't do your homework every time, Donovan? Like that seems to imply
it varies,
that this is a special occasion.
It varies the quality of homework
Yeah, I get you.
No comment on Donovan and homework.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, Bruce, as your former professor, get some insight.
Speaking of,
Hey, I'm not going to break any FERPA rules or anything.
There you go.
But okay.
I mean, Daniel, you said that you were, your hype was kind of waning a little bit right beforehand. I was in the editing bay, and I probably watched this trailer 6 times a day leading up to that movie in UCA next to our grad room.
I remember the day it came out, and we watched it like 4 or 5 times before going to Bruce's class.
Yeah,
like,
we did.
Yeah.
And I mean, when the movie came out, we had a paper due the next week actually. And I was so consumed by the movie after it came out. I watched like 3 times that weekend. It was extremely hard to get tickets for, which was, I thought, very fun and exciting because it made a challenge for it. And I ended up making my paper, Why is Gamora? That was the title of my paper. And
yeah, Bruce, how was that paper? I'm kidding. I'm sure you remember the paper title, or just for the title.
I'm sure, yeah. I'm sure he's got a lot of comments on it. But, I was consumed with the movie, and I think I was also in your camp, Daniel. I was blown away by like how they managed to juggle all these characters, and and put us in a place where it ended and created the ultimate, I would say, our generation's Empire Strikes Back, and even bigger so, because when time and Empire come out, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have just global distribution like we did now. And this time was another level. I mean, you had to go dark on the internet if you wanted to avoid spoilers. There's still memes today created from all the MCU, but this movie particularly. And I felt like it was just a global event that led into what at the time was the biggest box office movie of all time with Endgame. But it was special for me because I come into California at the same time, watched it 1,000 times in California, and I just love it. And it is interesting. There is a few plot things that you can always poke at, of course, which we'll get into. But I think overall they deserve a pat on the back. As much as I love Endgame and I love where it leaves me emotionally, I think this is the better movie. It's just tighter. I think almost all the jokes land, and I think it's expertly crafted, and I don't know how they did it, honestly. It seems like a nightmare thinking about the logistics behind it. But let's start out the movie. And one reason I want to talk about this movie in particular, one thing me and Daniel talk about a lot on the podcast, Bruce, is how the MCU movies, they always kind of, at least after the first phase, started resembling more of a TV show, right? Each episode or each movie become like its own episode leading up to a series finale with the Avengers or a Civil War with a crossover of that like. And it's weird because they kind of became this TV on the silver screen, and now they're actually like making movie like structures, but on television with Disney Plus. So they've kind of reverted back to what they originally become. And so I always thought Infinity War was a weird movie because how could someone like how could someone like Mark Siedemann come in and watch Infinity War without watching the preceding 19 movies beforehand? And could they understand it? Which I think they could, but there's so many little payoffs, so many little lines of dialogue that tie back to every single moment and every single movie in the MCU. I think it's just incredible. So let's start.
I was going to say that's really interesting, and in fact, they have these phases, right? Of phase 1, phase 2, that are almost like seasons in a way of a TV show. And I'm glad you brought that metaphor, but I do want to follow up on it in terms of like as we go through, what it means to be, whatever the 20th movie in this series, and kind of how you're making sense of that if you are not, sort of a quote unquote fanboy or whatever,
It's really interesting. But let's start the movie off. So the movie comes right off the edges of Thor Ragnarok, right? So we're with Thor, we're with Loki, we're with Thanos and his the children of Thanos, so to speak. And we know Thanos for this entire saga so far, the Infinity Saga, he's after these stones, and these stones imbue certain powers. And also, if he has all 5 stones, which will get full clarity later in the movie, if he snaps his fingers, he can wipe out half the universe. So the first scene starts here with, we have Thor, and we're basically starting in media res, right? Thanos has already won this particular battle. He is now trying to, get the the Tesseract stone from Loki, and it kind of starts us off here, boys.
Yeah. And just to be clear, there's 6 stones, right? But he's got 1 before the movie starts, so he's got to get 6, 5 over the course of the movie. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just, we've kind of been less detailed on some of our structural stuff, but since we're planning on a 2-episode arc here, I kind of want to dig into that too. So
sure,
I just want to mention, at least for my breakdown, I had 10 sequences that this movie's divided into that range anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes a piece. So this clearly is obviously our first sequence. And it almost is functioning a bit like a prologue. I mean, it's not really, but it almost feels that way a little bit. So, yeah.
Yeah, I had it end right around the 10-minute and 30-second mark, or 10-minute. Rowan Hulks kind of goes into the Earth's atmosphere is kind of when I ended it, but you could kind of probably extend it up to the title sequence.
Opening credit title.
Yeah, which is about like 11 and a half maybe. But in that whole thing, we learned a lot of things, right? We learned that Thanos is after the stones. We learned Loki is actually turning a leaf over, and he sacrifices himself. He don't sacrifice himself. He tries to kill Thanos and loses.
Right.
And I mean, there's so many nuggets here we can break down just in this opening scene alone. And Daniel, what do you think about it? I mean, like, to me, this was the cinematography, all these things. I was like, holy shit, this is going to be a movie. And the stakes are already set up with Hulk being destroyed by Thanos in a fist fight. So he's not only physically strong, he's mentally mentally he's also physically strong as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the scene, it's very technically, I think this movie, even just in a narrative sense, it delivers all the information exactly kind of when it needs to. I feel like I don't think like as much as it jumps around and all this stuff, I've never feel confused. And to me, this first scene, it obviously gives us, Thanos got 1 stone. He's sending these guys to Earth. Loki is dead. And I think, but for me, this opening scene is mostly just about tone and kind of setting a different tone for this film. And I think it does that obviously through, we're starting off with the bad guy just beating, the shit out of our heroes to, 2 of the strongest heroes, at least in the known, universe. And then very brutally killing Loki. I mean, it kind of just, I feel like sometimes when you get death scenes, especially in content that is at least made with a large amount of youth audience in mind, it may not be made for kids, but kids are definitely in the forefront. To just hang on that shot and just watch him kind of slowly choke the air out of him, I think, to me, I remember watching that theater and being like, oh damn, this is real. This feels like, I feel like I'm watching Game of Thrones now, right? Like, I don't know who could die when, and it all feels like it would work. And I think as a tone piece and kind of establishing that this feels different than your average bad guy, I think it works great. And I think it's honestly Josh Brolin, man, he just does a wondrous job at this role. And I think there's just little things that he brings out that are oftentimes non-dialogue. Like the way he like looks at Loki when he like kind of turns at him and gives him like this like kind of half grin, this kind of like, is there any more air in there? And it's just like this evilness to it that just feels real. It feels like, okay, this feels like a real character. I don't know. Yeah, I think it's a great scene. I think it sets the tone, and it feels surprisingly quick for 10 or 11 minutes. Personally, I feel like this whole movie feels a lot quicker than it is, and I think that's a testament to it.
I agree. Yeah, I mean, there's a few little nuggets here that are just interesting to talk about. One, just on a mythology scale, but also just on all the things that happen in this 11 and a half minutes here. One, Hemdale dies, who's been in all the movies, played by Idris Elba. He's gone, right? And that's a kind of a big actor and also a big character within the Thor mythos. He's gone. And we just come off the fact that Thor lost his sister, his mom, his dad, and then he loses his friend Hemdale. Now he loses his brother, Loki, right? And he says this all stuff later in the movie. So he's just constantly being shown grief and constantly just suffering like the worst amount of losses. And even that, he also lost Asgard in the previous movie. It literally exploded, Asgard did. So constant there. I think we have a great introduction to the children of Thanos. I think all of them, the CGI, I think it works most of the time. There's a few times, of course, they don't work, look as great as it does other times, even though it's still amazing. But them having this dark, shadowy cinematography really lends itself to the CGI as well, especially Thanos. I mean, some moments you're like, holy shit, is that a real person almost? Right. To me, it looks like it sometimes, especially in the eyes and just the face itself. But we also...
It's the most impressive full CGI, like complete CGI character I think I can recall.
It's great. It's fantastic.
For me. Yeah.
And his performance comes through 100% to me, and through I can tell it's Josh Brolin doing the lines and doing the facial capture and everything.
Yeah.
And but it ends off this scene with Bruce being defeated, sent to Earth by Hemdale, and we get that little nod even with Loki saying we have a Hulk, right? Which calls back to Avengers 1 when Tony tells Loki we have a Hulk. So all these little things kind of are great, and I want to reference all those things as we're going through there. Just for fun. So, and also this kind of sets up our one-liner for the end when Thor tells Thanos, I'm going to kill you for that, right? We're already setting up the one-liner in the very first scene of the movie, which is how you should do it. So that's already happening, and we kind of establish Thanos as a threat. Bruce is at the Sanctum Sanctorum, and he lands, and Wong and Doctor Strange are basically arguing over tuna sandwich, and the wonders of the world there. And we get who is Thanos, and he's coming, and we get the title card, right? So I think that kind of ends our first sequence there in the first 11 minutes. I would say.
Yeah, I would just, one thing that I would add, that I think sets the tone for this movie is while there is clearly some action in that first sequence, there's not as much as you would expect for this kind of movie. I mean, typically when you watch a big action blockbuster that's divided into sequences, that first sequence is generally like, let's jump straight into not just the action, which you're right, this does, it jumps in media res, but in the sense of like a really big opening action sequence. This one's a little more subdued, which I think is purposeful, because for one, you don't need to hook everyone in the first 10 minutes, which is sort of the conventional Hollywood wisdom. And two, sets the tone for a slightly more somber, serious movie that's still going to have plenty of action in it. But, as you said, with, what we get with Idris Elba's character and with Loki, bad things are happening from the start.
Yeah, and that's a good point about them not starting off with like a giant action sequence, because, it's just another example of we've had so many movies. We don't have to. We theoretically going into this, you would know at least some of these characters in some of these movies, and you have a more of emotional connection to that versus your need to be entertained in terms of spectacle. So, I think that's right.
Yep.
Yeah. So our next one I would say is, we have after
it gets
Bruce,
pretty easy to see. Sorry, go ahead. I feel like the sequence is like basically for a while now, every time we jump characters, new sequence.
Yeah,
pretty
I
much.
agree.
And at least until, well, yeah, for most of the rest of the movie, it feels like every time we jump locations or jump to a different set of characters, it's pretty much just sequence by characters. Which I think, even jumping slightly ahead, like I feel like this movie flows so well from sequence to sequence. And I think, it's obviously like when you're juggling multiple, when it's a sequence film with like the cast of varying wildly between the sequences, I think that can be difficult, but I just think the way we flow into New York and then we follow Hulk into New York, we follow the music into space. You know what I mean? We just have these really great segues that to me just keep me entertained, honestly. Like it just is, as soon as I'm kind of waning maybe on one sequence or one character, it's like, great, we're going to a new set and it's kind of a whole new thing with very different tones and everything.
I do think it does get a little more complicated, not this particular sequence, but like starting with the next sequence. I do think a lot of times there are two sets of characters we track within one sequence, but there's always one who has a goal that ends the sequence in the way that you're talking about, that feels like, we've got a natural moment now to jump somewhere else. But we almost always have either the setup of another set of characters who are at the beginning of doing something or in the middle of doing something. So to me, that was one of the more fascinating things about tracking this movie, is the way it sort of plays with what characters are in each sequence and when it moves and how it does that. But I agree, sequence 2, I think, is very straightforward. I mean, it focuses on, we do go to two sets of characters, but they come together very quickly, right? So we've got Doctor Strange and Wang and Bruce Banner, and then we get Tony and Pepper, and then those two sets of characters come together. And then in the middle of that, Spider-Man joins in, right? So we're slowly bringing characters in, and then the children of Thanos arrive, and so we've got probably our first more wide-ranging fight, scenes, or battle scenes, action scenes. Yeah.
I mean, I think a couple things. One, I think in the first half of the movie, you can really see the sequences a little easier, and I think as the second half kind of kicks in, it becomes those same sequences or same characters, but they start obviously cross-cutting them to kind of ramp up the action, because I was like writing down times and I was pausing the movie. In the second half, I'd like pause it way more times. So I was like, okay, now I'm back with Thor for 30 seconds. Now I'm back with Thor for 45 seconds. And like I was really doing that the last. I was like, damn, I'm gonna not finish this movie.
You're right. That happens more in the last few sequences for sure.
Yeah. Real quick, can we? Maybe we didn't say it, but who are we going to assign the goal to in the first sequence here? Is it Thanos? Is his goal to get the power, or is it Space Stone? Yeah, the Space Stone. Who are we getting the goal there on that one?
So, it's interesting because certainly almost any sequence where Thanos is playing a major part, his goal is very clear, right? But there are also sequences where he's not around and the children of Thanos are, pursuing goals on his behalf. So I still focus it on our protagonist, but all of the goals are double-sided pretty easily. I mean, I think as we go through, they'll hardly ever be, but even again, like with Thor's goals don't really involve them at all, which is why I made the comment I did at the beginning. So like for sequence 1, I would say the goal is for Thor to try to stop Thanos from getting the Space Stone, right? And he fails at that. And then
but I would say, we don't ever see him try in sequence 1. All we see him is being defeated after he tried.
He gets like one punch in. That's it, maybe.
Yeah, that's right. He comes around and hits him like with one thing, and it does like nothing. That's right.
Well, and I say Thor, but I think most of the time we're looking at groups of characters, right? So if we wanted
Asgardians,
exactly, we could say Thor, Loki, and Hulk, right? Even though Hulk doesn't necessarily know what's going on exactly, but
well, what I did, I broke it down like Team Thor, Team Iron Man and Team Cap.
Right.
That's what I did in my little breakdown here. I thought it was probably the easiest thing to do, and also maybe the Guardians, which it kind of becomes Team Thor and also Team Iron Man. So
Right.
that's how I broke it down, just because in Civil War we kind of had that division there, and I thought it was good to kind of track those three, because also Endgame really hammers home, no pun intended, that we're following these three characters in their journey to kind of almost end them, especially two of the three. But anyway,
Right. Yeah, and these groups get established relatively early on, although we will see, you mentioned the Guardians and Thor, and then those two groups sort of split apart. So it seems like we've got three main groups, but really we kind of end up with four main groups, and so we get to sequence 2, and our group is, Strange, Tony, and then Peter, right? And so, yeah, I would say then that their goal in sequence 2 is to stop the children of Thanos from, you say, taking Strange or trying to get the stone from Strange. They're really just trying to get the stone. That kind of fails, and so then they're just going to take Strange, right? I don't know the names of the individual children. That was kind of confusing to me, but it doesn't really matter. But just for talking about it. But the skinny looking dude who's super powerful.
Squidward, yeah. I called him Squidward. No, it's not, but that's what Tony calls him, is Squidward.
Right.
Yeah. Which is amazing.
And he's like floating.
It's great, yeah.
He's like towing Strange, who's tied up, and then, he sort of flies out and all that stuff's happening. But yeah, then the goal becomes, okay, fine, if I can't get the stone now, then I'm just going to take Strange and put him on the ship. They're obviously all trying to stop that. And once again, we have another failure, right? Because they don't stop it, and they all end up on his spaceship flying off into wherever.
And I would say I feel like maybe I could make the argument for 2 sequences even in here, because once Hulk arrives, I think it feels like the goal is just to try to get the teams together. The goal is, we got to call Cap. We got to explain this to Tony, and then we got to call Captain America so we can all get together and be prepared for this. That's kind of the immediate goal. And then once, the Ring of Death arrives, then it's kind of like, oh, well, shit, we don't have time for that. We have to react to this now.
Well, see, to me, that's where the sequences get a little more complicated, because if that's a sequence, it's only like 6 minutes long. It's not a very long sequence. And I think when you really dig in, what you see happening is that a lot of times there is, like, in a 15-minute sequence, there's like a 5-minute something that doesn't really get finished. And then there's a 10-minute something that has a more definitive goal and conclusion, right? Or a climax of some kind. You're right. I mean, before the spaceship arrives, they're just all sort of talking among themselves, and we're getting a lot of exposition, but the goal feels less clear cut, right? And really all they do is establish a goal, which is, we need to find Vision and protect him.
Right.
But then they never really do anything about it. So they sort of talk a lot and they formulate the beginnings of a plan, but it doesn't really naturally conclude, right? There's just a new thing that happens. And so that's, for me, why I put them in the same sequence. Obviously this is it's slightly academics, just about understanding how the movie works. But yeah, that's why I kind of still keep those as one, because there's always something that just doesn't feel whole, and it's sort of like they purposefully knew that in order to cover all these things, they'd have to have like an anchoring part that does have a goal and a climax, and then these other parts that are just setting up future goals and climaxes. So that's kind of how I saw it.
When you say that 5-10 ratio of like 5 minutes setting up and then 10 minutes of something else, is that you saying for this movie, or saying in generally how sequences kind of work?
No, just for this one. And I think this is really unusual, because I think Daniel's instinct is right, in the sense that normally when you're breaking things down in the sequences, you're not jumping around a whole lot. I mean, it's part of why you do sequences, but there are other movies that do that, that will have, they'll have a 10 to 15 minute sequence that's built around one smaller level goal, but in the middle of that somewhere, they will jump over to another plot line for a couple of minutes and then come back. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I know there's one that I've broken down before that does that. I can't remember if it's a Bond movie or something else, but no, I think this is really unusual. In some ways, you'd almost expect it to have an act structure, because an act structure lends itself to jumping around really quickly a lot, right? On the other hand, action movies more and more these days are almost exclusively built around sequences or sequences within acts. And so this feels like, and certainly the other Avengers movies, also use sequences. So it makes sense that that's just the way they think about these movies.
Yeah, it's interesting because I wonder too, because I agree, there does seem to be this like, we start one thing, but then usually the antagonist interferes, right? Or like, again, I think that this is a great example of like why Thanos is more of the antagonist, is he's the active one, and really we're mostly reacting most of this movie. There is obviously like some stuff in the middle, especially with the Guardians, where they're trying to be proactive, but none of that works. Like every time they try to be proactive, it kind of always fails. And most of the time it's the heroes having to change plans because, well, the villain then did this, or the villain then did that, or what they did didn't work, or whatever. And I feel like it is interesting because we had that opening little scene with Tony and Pepper talking about which is again like that is even, it almost happens a little bit twice. We kind of have this like emotional setup for like something that gets paid off in the next movie about Pepper being pregnant and them having a baby together, and then Doctor Strange comes and is like, no, Thanos is coming. We got to get everybody together. We got to protect stuff. And then in the middle of that, when they're about to actually take action, like literally, Tony's hand is like over the button to call Cap. It's like, that's when the villains will show up and they have to start reacting again. And I think what that does to me is it feels like the heroes never get a chance to kind of catch their breath. Again, we get that a little bit in the middle, even with like Tony and Peter figuring out how to get Doctor Strange free and stuff like that. But most of the time it's like, they're getting surprised most of this movie and getting caught off guard. And I think that just puts them into kind of this reactionary state, which traditionally you would think, well, that isn't great, right? For your, we're saying protagonists and like the good guys and bad guys. I think sometimes I'm saying protagonists is like the good guys and antagonists is the bad guys. But yeah, it is interesting. It is. Well, it's complicated in a way that somehow still works.
I think it is great. And here's why. And this is kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but a few things. I think you're right. They totally foreshadow, and they call her Morgan in this opening sequence, Morgan Stark, and her name is Morgan in Endgame. So there's some weird prophecy there that he almost has for his future daughter. And you're right. A lot of the movie, I mean, we've already had one failure in the first sequence. We're fixing to have another failure with this sequence. And we ultimately know we have a pretty big failure at the end of it. I mean, I think it's perfectly fine and okay because Civil War set all this up, right? I mean, if you look at it, and it's hard to do it from a movie perspective because it's like, again, I feel like this is a series finale and versus a movie. The reason why they fail in every situation is because they are broken up as a team. And it ain't until the next one that they do succeed, right? So him even like, I love that Bruce says, hey, just get the fuck over it. Like the world's ending. You got to call Cap. And I'm glad there's no scene where he wrestles with it. He's just like, takes like 15 seconds. He's like, you're right. I'm going to call him. Like that's a smart thing to do because he's smart. And it does get interrupted, but he wouldn't have had to call him. Obviously he wouldn't have, all that kind of stuff. They could have beat Thanos if they had all been there together for the first time. They could have done it. And I think that is why, I mean, obviously it's a movie constructing the coincidence of them being interrupted. He doesn't get to call Cap because of this, X, Y, and Z, but that's what makes it special. That's what makes the payoff even better down the line. So it's totally fine. It's totally okay. It's earned through Civil War. So
one thing I'll criticize a little bit, and this is probably more a criticism of comic book story stuff, because if you're telling the story, you just got to do it. But sort of the structure of 6 stones and he needs them all to do this thing. It's sort of a very classical, slightly cliched kind of thing, and it is interesting that normally it's sort of like linear, like I need this, then I need this, then I need this, and then I get them all, and now I'm powerful. And obviously that would be a really bad structure. So, I mean, it'd be really repetitive. So, having the children of Thanos and sort of splitting it all up and having it all happening simultaneously and jumping around is clearly a smart choice. And I'm imagining the comic books did it similarly. But you do end up having to have that slightly clunky exposition scene, in Doctor Strange's mansion, where it's sort of like, here's all the stones, here's what each one does. And of course, if you're not super tuned in, you will immediately lose track of that. And they kind of become MacGuffins for the most part, right? I mean, they could be anything. The 6 stones could literally be anything. He just needs all 6 of them to do his thing. The only one that is special, I think, is the time stone, right? Because that plays a key part in the climax of the movie. Most of the other stones,
he has to have it first. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and when he does the other things, like, when he does other things, you don't even know what stone he's using to do that, right? And I can't remember all the things that he does, but he turns Star-Lord's gun into a bubble thing, right? What stone is he using? Doesn't matter, right? I have no idea. Or maybe that's even inherent in his powers. Who cares? But the time stone is super important, right? Because he has to rewind time at the end to fulfill his goals.
I don't know. I'll push back a little, because one thing I noticed this the first few times I watched it, and I really noticed it this time. It's actually pretty smart in the way it's what, again, I don't know how they figured all this shit out, but it's smart in what order he obtains the stones, and then also what order he uses what powers to get from sequence to sequence. I think there's and also how it sets up expectation for other moments of action. An example, when Star-Lord pulls the trigger for to kill Gamora, which we'll get into in a second, it's bubbles, right? And then we know whenever she's fixing to kill herself, it's also bubbles. So it's setting up powers. Like it could have been smoke, but they chose bubbles twice to kind of set up the fact that Thanos is doing this with the Reality Stone.
Right.
And I think they did a good job, though, of the first one he has is the Power Stone. I guess I think it's the Power Stone, and I'm pretty sure it's the Power Stone.
See,
I'm pretty sure.
I do think they do a good job, but that's not really for your average viewer. That part, I feel like that part is for us, for the geeks that are know the details in the comic. That your average viewer, even your just average MCU fan, probably not going to pick up on any of that. And I think that's fair.
I mean, you can compare me and my wife. I mean, my wife has watched a lot of them with me and hardly knows what's happening from one movie to the next. She's watched each one at the theater. She goes to watch this. She doesn't remember anything about any of the previous movies, right? I've watched all of them. I've watched them as they've come out. I can track characters and stuff like that, but I'm not tracking it at that level. I haven't watched them that many times. I'm not familiar with the comics and what has or hasn't been in them. So for me, it's just he needs these 6 stones. And I might make a couple of connections. I mean, I guess the Reality Stone is the stone he's using when he creates the illusion that the Collector is
and they do some good lines.
The stone yet.
He says reality can be whatever I want it to be now. And I think they do some good stuff like that for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. But the other time I look at some of the other ones, I don't really know. I'm not saying it's not in there, but I'd really have to go back and watch it just for that. Okay, well, he gets the Mind Stone. I mean, he gets that at the end, but does he use it for anything, or does
and what does the Soul Stone do?
After
what does the Soul Stone
exactly.
do?
That,
I don't know what the Soul Stone does.
What is its powers? What it does either. The Soul Stone,
yeah. So anyway, So you do have this thing of and it's kind of fun. It is I think the benefit of it is it does give us a visual thing, right? He's got a gauntlet. It's got spots for 6 stones, and he's getting closer. So even if you can't track exactly what the stones are or what they do, at least you have this nice visual representation of how close he's getting to being able to get rid of everybody, right? So
Yeah. And
Yeah,
to
and
be
I think-
fair, real quick, to be fair, like we also have seen almost all these stones except the Soul Stone in the previous movies. I mean, the Mind Stone is Loki's scepter in Avengers 1. That's how he controls people's minds, particularly Hawkeye. And also that's how Vision gets the Mind
It's
Stone
Vision.
from Ultron.
Yeah.
Right? So
Right.
it's the Mind Stone. We know the Ether in Thor the Dark World is the Reality Stone, which is being used to do the convergence. And which I know it's a lot of fucking homework, you know.
But see, yeah, and that's not something I like. That's not something I tracked. Having watched all the movies and like followed kind of loosely what's happening with all the characters, at that level, I'm like, okay, I know this. There was things and other things, but yeah,
exactly.
I'm definitely
it's
tracking track of it. Yeah,
and it's hard. But I think it's what's interesting about the movie is, again, it's a weird
And
movie.
I think too. What
for
I
all
think
this
about the
homework to
movie
be
too
involved.
is most of the times with each stone, it's not about the stone; it's about what he has to do to get it, or what happens in order for him to obtain it. You know what I mean? Like I think Bruce has a point that eventually, I mean, especially once he gets them all, he just has unlimited power to basically do like literally anything, right? And like that could that's like kind of your in narrative wise, like that's like the biggest MacGuffin. Like, oh yeah, I have this ring. It lets me do whatever I want at any point, no boundaries, But I think what we remember about the stones is what took place when they were obtained, or what was sacrificed, who was killed, what the scene was like, and all these kinds of things. And it's really like what the movie does well is it makes these scenes when he gets these stones character scenes and character moments. Even with the Reality Stone and Star-Lord and Gamora, it's not about, we knew he's going to get the stone. That's not what it's about. It's about this moment between Star-Lord and Gamora and Thanos, and starting to develop a deeper, more complicated relationship there. And that's why that scene is like memorable. Not because he got the stone, not because of even what he did with it for me. It's the Gamora trying to stab him and bursting into tears when she thinks she's killed him. Like that kind of stuff is what makes that. And it's even at the end with Wanda crying her eyes out, killing Vision, and then having to watch him be put back together and killed. Like that kind of stuff. You know what I mean? That's like, that's what you remember. Those character moments. And I think, that's why I think Marvel has been as successful as they are, is because yes, it's about the lore. Yes, it's about the action scenes, and it's about the cool powers and the cool characters. But what they do almost usually, I would say most of the time they do really well, is the heart kind of level stuff with these characters and make you care about them. And that I think the fact that these are basically MacGuffins and we care so much about the journey to get a bunch of MacGuffins is a credit to the movie and a credit to how they told the story.
No,
all right, let's move to sequence.
I think you're 100% right.
3 or whatever.
Sequence 2 ends, of course, I think right around the 26 minute mark, with Bruce actually calling Cap, what appears to be Cap, right? And we know Spidey is on the ship.
Has anyone tried calling that number, by the way? Does it go to I hope it's like a pre-set up like Captain Steve Rogers voicemail. Like,
I would love it.
Hello,
That'd be
you've
great.
reached Steve Rogers. Yeah.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah, I think once they're on the spaceship and the spaceship goes flying off, we're now into sequence 3, where we cut to the Guardians of the Galaxy.
Yeah, and can we just pause for a second and say, having the title card be just space is like fucking
perfectly
brilliant.
tone setting.
Yeah.
Again,
Oh my
this
God.
movie just tone wise, it nails it. And I think I remember in the theater watching this first time and hearing that dum 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 of the Rubber Band Man song, and I was like, it's going to Guardians. Like I knew it immediately just because of how musically influenced we've had them already be, and just all this stuff. You're like, of course it is.
That's a really nice transition. Yeah,
it's perfect.
Oh, it's
I
fantastic.
love this scene is probably, or this sequence is probably my favorite sequence in the whole movie. I think the comedy is just spot on. I think Star-Lord and Thor have some really hilarious chemistry. And I think it just feels fun, but also serious, but also just kind of this, I don't know, everything that I want kind of from these sequences is kind of in one of these sequences. And seeing characters that we've never seen on screen together just bounce off each other is so fun. And just, I love this scene so much.
What's one thing I was going to say earlier too, Daniel? You mentioned the fact that like the pacing of it, keeps your interest. And one thing I think is just as important or even more important is like we're for the first time in those first 20 minutes of the movie, we've had Tony meet Doctor Strange, we've had Spidey meet Doctor Strange, we've had Bruce meet all those guys. It's like scene after scene, we're getting payoff in terms of just character interaction. I mean, in this scene alone, it starts sequence 3, we're getting Thor with the Guardians. Could you imagine, in 2010 when we had Thor 1 and then Guardians
exactly.
that they're going to be together? I mean, it's just that kind of stuff is.
I wouldn't have known who Guardians was. You know what I mean?
That's
like,
true because they weren't
who's
out
that?
Yet. But it's just like fan service galore. But they do it in a very a deliberate way to kind of move the plot forward, right? And I think this one, you're right. The comedy is exceptional in the sequence, and also we get a lot of meat in terms of we get the plot fixing to happen, right? We know that here Gamora explains the stones. She even says the snap of his finger here, and then we also get the trajectory that Thor, he needs a weapon, right? He's lost Mjolnir in his previous movie, and he's already got his ass whipped by Thanos once, so he has to go off and do it again. Get a new weapon, and then they decide, the Guardians, that they're going to go fight Thanos, which I wrote down mistake next to the movie because like to me it's just like it's even symbolic again of like so far the reason why they failed is because they're not together. And what's the first thing they do when they get these two powerful groups together? They split up, and it causes bad things to happen. Like if they had all just went to a Thor to get a new hammer, then Thanos never would have got the Gamora, which is the Soul Stone essentially. So it's just automatic. Like this idea of splitting up is detrimental to their survival.
Yeah, that's pushed interestingly in that sequence, mostly because Thor doesn't care about the Guardians of the Galaxy, and he knows how powerful Thanos is, and he's perfectly willing to let them go off and try to confront Thanos. I mean, I guess he knows that Gamora is Thanos' daughter, so maybe he thinks it's more complicated. But yeah, I mean, anyone who really cared would probably be like, I don't think that's a good idea, but he's like, yeah, fine, you do that. I'm going to go with the rabbit, and we're going to, get me a new hammer.
Just Chris Hemsworth comedic timing with how he just casually delivers some of these lines back. Like, it just sounds like a normal guy. Like, oh yeah, they're like, what about Kevin Bacon? He's like, I don't know, he might be on the team. I've been there a while. Like, it's just like these little things that are just like delivered so perfectly and so nonchalantly from him that mixed with Star-Lord, who's just this overly dramatic everything that's feeling very, emasculated and all that kind of stuff. I think it just, it's like, I want more of it. And that's what I'm hoping we get when we get the next Guardians movie, or Thor movie that has the Guardians in it. It's just more of that bouncing off, because I think Chris Hemsworth is just this to me is like, this is why, like, I don't know, like I could watch a lot of movies of him doing more comedy, because I think it works really well.
Yeah, this version of Thor in Infinity War is by far my favorite version across the MCU. Is the cross between, in Ragnarok they really went the comedic route. But I think the Russos did a good job of bringing him back to like an emotional place in this movie, but still giving him the comedic chops. But like it's the writing really helps. Like if they do improv and in Ragnarok, it kind of like it's hit and miss, like most improv.
I agree.
But here it feels very deliberate and very like intentional. That plus his acting plus the emotional stakes behind it, it's by far my favorite Thor, and I wish they would keep with this version of Thor like the most like complete across the movies. But I bet we'll go back to more comedic, which makes sense. But anyway, I mean, there's a lot going on here. We know that now there's two trajectories, right? We're going to nowhere. We're going to Never Near, where Etri the dwarf is.
It's Nidavellir.
Okay, yeah, it's where
Wikipedia,
the forge, the celestial forge.
Yes.
Also, I think in terms of looking at the structure, this is an interesting sequence, because this is, I think, in terms of Daniel sort of making smaller sequences, like this is the place where that argument is strongest, because I actually put the stuff with Vision and Wanda in this sequence also.
Really?
And I think the natural thing is to think to separate those. because they are, in terms of what I've been talking about, in terms of two things happening in a sequence, this sequence is the place where the two things are by far the most distinct and feel like it should be two sequences. And you could make that argument that it is. On the other hand, each sequence would be like 7 minutes long. They would be very short, and not necessarily accomplishing a lot. And I did like really highlight this, and I was like, okay, well, is there a split here when we cut to Vision and Wanda? Are we in a new sequence or not? And I think you could argue it either way. But just to sort of pick up on what I was saying before, and I think it's going to play out more strongly in later sequences, the reason that I didn't count the Guardians and Thor as their own sequence is because they don't really have a goal, right? I mean, it's planning, right? It's all like, you know, when they leave, it's just, we're going here, we're going here. But I mean, you could give them a goal, which is like to figure out what to do, but that's a pretty weak goal compared to the other goals in the movie, right? I mean, most of the other sequence goals I think we'll see are much stronger, and there's no real strong climax. You know, they don't really succeed at anything. There's no sense even that when they split up that this is a big deal, right? You know, if you had split Star-Lord and Gamora up at that moment, it would feel like a much bigger deal. But when Rocket and Groot go with Thor, there's no emotional like, oh my gosh, they're split up and maybe they'll never see each other again or anything like that. It's all very casual. So to me, that just didn't, you know, it doesn't feel like it's done something as a unit. It's sort of like it's like the setting up of something that's going to pay off later. But then we've got a more complete, even though it's only 7 or 8 minutes, goal and climax with Vision and Wanda, right? Vision and Wanda come under attack. The goal is to protect Vision. And as you mentioned earlier, Donovan, they succeed, right? This is the first point where they succeed at something. They're able to fight off the children of Thanos once Captain America arrives, and they're successful in that battle. The children run away and they all decide to go back to headquarters or whatever.
Yeah, and even what's interesting too, talking about like starting and stopping goals. In sequence 3, I mean, the Guardians are after, you know, I guess money or they're going to investigate, which then Thor shows up and stops that happening, which is very natural. I think it's a natural plot progression. And you're right, they kind of don't have, other than, and they kind of weekly plan what's going on. You know, they don't really have a super strong goals other than to stop Thanos. And it seems like that's the main goal. Like,
well, yeah, and
stop. Yeah,
they set up goals, right? And so Thor now has a goal, which is to get himself a new hammer, and Gamora has a new goal, which is to stop him from getting whatever stone the Collector has.
Reality Stone, yeah.
But they don't really do anything about it, right? In that 7 minutes, they just decide that's what they'll do, and they're not really active towards doing it, which is, again, why I didn't put it as a separate sequence. Although, I could understand why you would. I mean, I'm not declaring myself like absolutely correct or anything. That's just what I was seeing in the movie that led me to put those things together in one unit.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you're right. And after this sequence with them and Thor, we go to Scotland, right, where we pick up with Vision and Wanda, which is really cool in its own right because it's the first time they've been together in the MCU. And it also really starts like after you've seen WandaVision and now you're watching this, it's like, oh man, I remember these days, you know, like I remember the old days. And it was really cool seeing them and, you know, him in his human form, I think for the first time actually in the series at this point, and having the children of Thanos show up. And of course, gotta be one of the most badass things ever. Captain America in the train station in the shadow with a beard.
Right.
Oh man,
you know,
it's the best. It's like it's the first time we get the Avengers theme.
Oh yeah,
like full on. We get like a hint of it when we get to New York for the first time, but like we get like and it's just like adrenaline just starts pulsing through my veins. My hair stands up. It's like, oh my gosh.
It's also one of those. Right. Yeah, it's also one of those funny moments because, you know, everything stops. Like, I forget. I guess it's Wanda and they have like a sword at their throat or something. Thanos, right? And like Wanda looks over her shoulder, and then like the child of Thanos could like be killing Wanda, but
Yeah,
somehow
exactly,
just the aura of Cap is strong enough that even she's like, who's that in the shadows? As if she should care. Like she has no
Also,
idea.
I guess they just like
She
sensed
should
his
fucking
presence.
care, Bruce.
Well, she
'cause it's
should, but she
perfect.
doesn't know that she should care. But somehow
No,
she
she's
cares
fixing to
anyway, and
find
like the
out.
movie
And I-
just. Yeah,
I guess they just
it's
like
a lot of
sensed
fun,
his
yeah.
presence at like an ESP level or something because there's
Right.
a train coming through. How would they hear him? Like, there's no way. Maybe
Yeah.
he has like
They
a
have
lot
no
of cologne
idea,
on.
but it's just
He has a lot of cologne on. They're like, oh shit, Cap's in the room. You know what I mean? Like,
Well, Daniel, you mentioned also the score, and it's one thing I think this
Yeah.
movie doesn't get enough credit about. Alan Silvestri did the score for Avengers 1. Danny Elfman did 2, but he come back and did 3 and 4 here with Infinity War and Endgame. And I think the score is for both movies is magnificent. And it's like the MCU actually, in my opinion, is kind of weak when it comes to scores. There's probably like 2 or 3 you could probably name the top of your head, like, oh, that's a really good score. And one of them being the Guardian score, one of them being maybe Cap's score in First Avenger and Winter Soldier. But I think Alan Silvestri did an amazing job. And you're right. Whenever the Avengers thing kicks in here, it's like, fuck yeah, here we go. It's time to fuck her up, you know? So it's amazing. It's amazing.
yeah. And I always forget Falcon is in this movie till that scene. I'm like, oh yeah, Falcon. I'm like, oh.
Yeah.
I don't know why. Yeah.
No, it's cool seeing them three operate, right? Since Civil War, we've had the team disband, but now Falcon, Black Widow, and Cap are together. They're the quote unquote secret Avengers, right? They're still superhero.
Oh, I didn't know that was a. Is that like a comic run nod?
It is a comic run, yeah. And so it's quote, they're still doing superheroics, but under the guise of we don't care anymore, which is a big deal for Cap because his first 2 movies, 2.5, was all about following orders, and now he's fully. In the comics, he's called Nomad, and the directors have referenced him as being called Nomad in this. So Nomad Cap, which means he's against the law, like he's doing his own thing, which is great because, like, as the full character arc, it's amazing because it starts putting him in a different place and ultimately resolves him even better in Endgame. But yeah,
one of the interesting things about how they have to deal with this movie that I'll come back to with Thor is the powers of the various characters and who can confront who when, right? And it's interesting that sequence 3 is the first success. Now we have seen Thor lose before, but a little more complicated. Here, I think if with Captain America coming in, like he has to sort of defeat the children of Thanos, right? I mean, you sort of have this sense of who's got what levels of powers. And especially with Wanda, who's, in some ways the most powerful of anybody. But, the sort of like, but less even about their powers and more about sort of their reputation and how we feel about them as heroes. Having Captain America lose here also, I think, would just feel problematic and would almost stack the deck too much against them, So, we almost have to have a victory here, and it almost has to involve Captain America a little bit. I mean, you could have just had Wanda and Vision. They're pretty powerful. They could have beaten the children by themselves potentially, but there's something symbolic about bringing Cap into that and how he functions in terms of a leader and what our expectations are of his powers. Even though if you like ranked their powers, he might be lower, but the way the Marvel movie set them up, he rarely loses, so he actually is near the top. And I think that's an interesting way that they play with that and what that does for the subplots as we go through the movie.
And I think too, the fact that he's rescuing Vision, which the last time he saw Vision was trying to hunt him down. Vision was with Tony in Civil War, and so Vision was a part of the group trying to stop Cap. And so I think I mean, maybe I'm reading into it, but even in that moment where like Vision's like, "Thank you, Captain," or Steve, or whatever he says, it's kind of this like, yeah, I realized last time we met, like I was trying to put you in jail effectively, but you just saved my life when you didn't have to, or whatever. It just feels like there's just those kinds of little nods just seem everywhere. And again, you could watch this movie and never get that, and the movie doesn't. Right. It doesn't suffer for it. But I just think it's like one of those moments you're like, man, it's just consistency. I think for me, that's what the MCU is. It's consistent for the most part. It's really good consistency that like even though the world isn't very realistic in a lot of ways, at the same time, it is pretty realistic consistently throughout the different versions of or movies or whatever. And I think just little things like that to me are what just send it over the top.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right, Daniel. I mean, it's MCU is not perfect, but you have to get them credit when credit's due. They've done a good job of making you feel like that those kind of moments, even if it was unintentional, you're carrying so much baggage now narratively that you're going to apply that to it. I think, and I bet it was intentional too. I think it's they're very much going into this knowing where everybody was beforehand and where everybody's going to be afterwards. So I think more so than not, it's intentional, but it makes it feels good. It feels good when it all works out, and it's why we watch the stuff to begin with. So this sequence ends right around the 42-minute mark I had, where they get on the Quinjet and they're all fixing to go to Avengers Tower. And we know, question, I don't remember, does Kat mention that I got a text from Bruce or something like that? Does he say that? Or they just go to Avengers Tower?
I think they just go. They're just sort of like, let's go home,
Okay.
Yeah, he says that. Yeah. Let's go home. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I was kind of wondering.
I think we're just assuming that that's how he knew to go there, or to go get Vision, or whatever.
Yeah, it's a little less clear, but that's what I assumed too. Well, then we start the next sequence here. It's Gamora and Thanos in a flashback, and really starts painting Thanos' philosophy, and also kind of gives a little more meat into their relationship. The idea that killing half the universe is good for balance, like it'll stop poverty, it'll stop, all these other things, famine, and all these things that contribute to overpopulation. We can argue all day long about how many other things he could do with the stones. He could also do that.
When we came out of this movie, and I turned to Donovan, I was like, "Yeah, that was great, but if he had all the stones and was all powerful, why couldn't he find another solution to all these problems?"
Now, to be fair, I think that actually makes him a more realistic villain, because I think when you think of the worst villains of even human history, they're tunnel visioned, and they think what they're doing is absolutely correct, and there's no other option.
I think that's right, and I think that there is this kind of Thanos parallels Warmonger a little bit, right, from Black Panther, in the sense that they're both sort of set up as characters who have quote unquote good intentions. But in the end, I don't think Thanos does, as much as he's maybe a slightly complicated villain, and maybe it's more like it's good that he cares, and it's bad that he's the way he's doing it. But I think it's more than that. I mean, he seems to almost enjoy the killing and be happy to kill whenever he wants to, even when he doesn't have to. He has this strange code where he sort of gives his word and he says he won't kill someone and he doesn't. But I think you're right. I mean, he is a bad guy, and he's just bad anyway, regardless of whether he's talked himself into thinking that he's good. He's bad, and he could have done something else maybe, and it's maybe not so much a plot hole as it is an indication of his character. And
I think there's good.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think a good indication of all that right there is later on, whenever we meet Etri, and Etri says that, which is played by Peter Dinklage, which is brilliant. He says that he killed everybody but me. That's not balance. That's a sociopath.
Yeah.
And so there's flaws.
Yeah.
There's flaws in his own logic, and so it shows there that he doesn't. He may tell himself at night this is what he's doing for the greater good, but it's ultimately not. So,
which I think is great. I think that's realistic. I think that's almost more realistic than the warmonger, trying to pretend he really thought this was the best idea for everybody kind of thing. I think it makes Thanos almost like this religious zealot feeling, where he has he almost feels religious in his way. He's trying to balance the universe, and he feels he keeps talking about the destiny, the greatest destiny require the greatest will, or whatever he's talking about. It almost this, he kind of sees himself as a Christ figure. You definitely feel this kind of Messiah that will come and save everyone, with death. But go
I
ahead.
love the dialogue too.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, it's also interesting because he, again, going back to Warmonger, Warmonger is driven by emotion. He thinks that, he is right in thinking that Wakanda has become too isolationist and that they need to be broadening their horizons. But his desire to use to use that as a weapon to start war is about revenge.
Yes.
It's about anger. It's about who he is as a person. Whereas I think with Thanos, I mean, he is cold and calculating, right? I mean, there's no emotion in his choices at all. And even
Except one. Except one.
Yeah. And the movie
Except one
does
choice.
seem to imply that is truly an emotional choice or not an emotional, but that he feels those emotions genuinely when he trades Gamora for the Soul Stone, because presumably he wouldn't be given the Soul Stone if Gamora didn't mean anything to him, right? And I think the universe would have just been like, nope, you don't get it, which is what she thinks is going to happen.
Yes. And I completely agree. I mean, I think my favorite Thanos scene is the final one. I know we're kind of skipping around here a little bit, but like when he finishes and he's talking to little Gamora, you know what I mean? And like kind of that moment of like, because I think it's him, it's like his ideology crashing into his reality and even realizing that like, maybe I didn't even really want this kind of thing. And I think it's just, I think it's like those kinds of things that to me, like, Thanos feels like kind of the gold standard for how you make a villain, in some ways just your bad guy villain, but feel, even if it's, because I feel like there's almost like, because I agree, there's like, he almost feels relatable. They try to do things that are like, hey, this guy's, he went through some shit. That's why he's this way or whatever, but that it pulls back and he is just, at the end of the day, a bad guy with sociopathic homicidal tendencies
right.
Or whatnot, Anyway.
This sequence is also interesting because from here on out, it's one of the only sequences that doesn't jump to another plot line. So this is 100% Gamora and Thanos, which gives it power, because we now have a lot of plot lines in motion, but we're actually going to stop for a good, it's about 12 minutes the way I got it, 12 minutes where we don't cut to anything else, which I think is really interesting and kind of goes, Daniel, to your earlier point about everything that happens between, Gamora thinking she's killed Thanos and then Peter, or not, I guess there are two Peters, aren't there? Star-Lord is Peter and
Peters.
Peter Parker is Peter.
Yeah.
So, and Peter can't kill Gamora when he's supposed to, which leads to all kinds of problems down the road. So there are a lot of emotional moments in all of this. I will say one small plot problem that I had here was Thanos somehow knowing that Gamora was going to show up there. And maybe there is knowledge there that I've lost track of. But I don't know how he would know that she was even clued into what was going on until Thor had shown up. And we don't have a sense that he can read anyone's mind anywhere in the universe at any time. So it did feel a little convenient that he set up the illusion. And then when he breaks it and kind of laughs maniacally, another villain part by him, by the way, he just sort of says, oh, I knew you would come, is his justification for how he's prepped this whole thing.
No, you're right. It's very weak. There's nothing there that sets that up in any type of movie or scene or anything. So even while I was watching, I was like, how the fuck does he know they're going to be there? Like, I mean, we know that they cross paths with the Collector in the first movie, but that's no
the
reason.
Only thing. Yeah.
But and how would the big question is, how would he know that Gamora knows he's after the stones now? Like, presumably Thor's dead. Like, no, she's out doing her own thing. It makes no sense.
And
You're right. It doesn't.
I feel like between this and like the opening Guardians scene, you can tell it feels like they maybe struggled to like, how do we get the Guardians involved here? Well, they're just gonna go investigate a random ass, distress beacon. Like that's how they find Thor. It's very convenient. And then I think at the same way here, and I think once they get Gamora with Thanos and they kind of get the other Guardians doing their own thing, it works. But it does feel like they just had a little bit of like, and I get it. Like, I mean, like every other hero is based on Earth. And then you have the Guardians, which are based who knows fuck where, out in some part of the galaxy. And how do we get all of these people doing the same things on the same place and all that kind of stuff? It's a lot of work. And I think to their credit, they did, obviously do some things that just don't quite make sense, but the emotion of the moments, you don't care for the most part. You don't even notice.
Yeah. Of course, Bruce mentioned this a second ago, but one of the big things about this episode or this sequence, is, the fact that Thanos is pushing these characters. He's wanting to see what kind of characters he's dealing with here, and particularly who's with his daughter now. Which it is obvious in the movie he does consider her a daughter. He does care about her, but in his own sadistic way, he's going to test Quill's mettle, so to speak. And it's in the previous scene, she says, "Promise me you'll kill me," whenever it comes down to it, and he does. He does pull the trigger, so he had all the intention in the world to actually kill her, which is a pretty powerful thing. And then we get a failure.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, which I think you could have seen it coming a little bit. Obviously, when Thanos is like, "Yeah, sure," you know what I mean? But I think again, the chemistry between Peter and Gamora is really good there, and I think that really carries the scene.
It's great. And one little note too is that Drax, tries to kill Thanos, and his whole thing from the first Guardians movie is to kill Thanos. Right.
Yeah,
and they really do kind of nerf his character. Like, it makes sense that he doesn't really listen to Quill and all those kind of things. Like, that's totally in line with his character. But after that, like, Drax really doesn't get to do much of anything for the rest of the two movies. Like, they really kind of, he's no Tony Stark, right? And even Dave Bautista has come out and said, look, they chose other characters besides mine to do the big stuff, which obviously makes sense because he's not the biggest character. So that's a hard one to figure out. Like,
when you've got that many characters, there's going to be some that are near the bottom. Unfortunately, and especially the Guardians are interesting because neither Peter nor Drax are especially powerful. Mantis is probably the most useful character, and she plays a big part in their almost success. And then you've got Gamora, who, it's hard to know exactly how powerful she is. She's been trained by Thanos, so she's powerful in a way, but in other ways she doesn't seem to have superpowers. But obviously she's a big part of the story because of her connection to Thanos. So yeah, there's gonna be characters who just don't get as much as other characters. It's just the nature of the beast.
Yeah. No, yeah, it's interesting kind of seeing how some drop off. And it's no accident that we end up with the original 6, by the end of the movie.
Yeah.
Nope. So minute 54, I think, is the start of the next sequence, is where we're at Avengers compound. We're having Rhodey, aka War Machine, talk to General Thunderbolt Ross. And they're kind of assessing the situation. And of course, it almost looks like Rhodey called Cap in based on how he reacts. But clearly, we would assume Bruce. Bruce is there too in the background, so never mind. Yeah. Which is interesting. I guess Bruce doesn't show his appearance till Ross is gone, in fear of, I guess, Ross coming after him or something because he's a weapon, But it's a great moment. We have them come back.
Well, yeah, they have their history. Yeah. Ross is like the class. That's Bruce's classic villain. So yeah.
Yeah, which is kind of a weird opportunity not to have them look at each other one last time, sort of thing. But yeah, we have them meet up together, right? The Secret Avengers are with Rhodey and Bruce, and there's a little bit of reconciliation there between what happened to Rhodey and his legs, and Cap and them.
Some really awkward sexual tension between him and Black Widow.
Yeah, because they have to.
Right.
Yeah. Which most
fans even get the comment, "This is awkward."
Yeah, exactly.
Which, to be fair, that's nice that they kind of hang a lantern on it a little bit, I guess. But it is like, oh yeah, the last movie you like fell into her breasts. Oh yeah, that's right. That was weird. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Thanks, Josh Whedon.
We do get a note also of where Clint's at. He's on house arrest following Civil War, as well as Scott, who's also on house arrest, who's Ant-Man, which we know plays a pivotal part in Endgame, and also his movie explains when he's at in Ant-Man 2, which happens in between, which come out in between Infinity War and Endgame. Man, there's a lot of moving pieces in the MCU sometimes. Yeah. I won't lie. Sometimes it's like hard to keep up with sometimes.
Yeah.
But we get a great moment here, which is kind of an important through line, at least to the end of the movie, and I'd say even a lot of it in Endgame is we don't trade lives, Captain. And the idea that we're not, we're going to do everything we can to save you, even if it means destroying the universe.
To be fair, they do trade his. They do basically try to trade his life at the end.
Yes, they do.
And it just doesn't work. So I like the line because it's Cap, but it's also like kind of one of those Cap lines where you're like, well, that's a great sentiment, but like, how will that play out in the real world? And even if you look at Endgame, they trade more lives, at least one in particular. You know what I mean? Like, or two lives. You know what I mean? And so I feel like that's kind of one of those lines that's like, that sounds good, but I don't feel like it just necessarily holds up as like, this is a theme or something, I guess.
No, I think you're 100% right.
I mean, they're trying to save Vision up until the last moment, right? I mean,
they are. Yeah.
Sure.
And in fact, I think what stands out is if there's a problem there, it's the fact that Vision doesn't more strongly insist that they just kill him, that they do it sooner.
Right. I just think the movie kind of feels like it's treating that as like, oh yeah, we don't trade lives, when like the rest of the plot, I mean, even into Endgame is them trading lives, essentially. You know what I mean? Not as many, maybe like two versus like a bunch. I don't know. I guess to me, it just feels like it feels a little bit like the movie's trying to make that like a statement where this is like a theme, but I don't think it holds up as a theme.
Yeah.
I don't know if the movie's trying to say it. I think it's another situation where Cap's ideology kind of bumps up against reality, because immediately after he says it, Vision says, well, Cap, you did the same goddamn thing 60 years ago on the ice. Like, you're telling me I can't do this, but you did the same thing. It's Cat being
it's true. You're
almost too righteous. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
I just thought it was
You're right. It is.
I just thought it was a little interesting,
I kind of wish they would have done something with that later, though. Almost like having Cap confront that concept again and like, well, actually, sometimes we have to. And honestly, Cap can't always be the life traded, because he's like always like, well, if anybody's gonna do it, I'm gonna trade my life, first. And I feel like,
you could almost imagine a scene when, I mean, I don't remember exactly what happens, but when Wanda actually has to kill Vision to like her not want to do it, and Cap like put his hand on her shoulder and be like, it's okay. It's gonna be,
exactly.
Although that might get too much in the way of the romantic between, but interesting. The sequence. Go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say, what's really even it's hard to talk about this movie sometimes without talking about the past or even the future. It's just a weird thing. But if you look from the trajectory of Iron Man and Cap, they're switching arcs, right? Cap is the person that will lay on the line. Tony says, "I'll cut it." By the end of Endgame, Tony dies, right. And then Steve is the one who gets a happy ending. He's the one who actually hangs up the cow. So it's interesting seeing him make those kind of statements, almost like it's a reactionary thing. Like, I'm Captain America, this is what I kind of say, but he keeps getting beat up with the reality of the situation until at least the Endgame, which is where he rightfully becomes selfish, in a good way,
right.
In my opinion.
Right. Yeah. So this sequence is also interesting because this has that same structure as the previous ones, where, again, for me, I put this with what happens next, which is cutting to the spaceship with Strange, Tony, and Peter. Because, again, we've got 5 or 6 minutes where they mostly form a plan, but there's no climax, right? The plan is, okay, the only place where we can try to deal with Vision is Wakanda, so let's go there. But they don't really do anything. It's just all formulation and planning, and then with no strong climax, right? And so I think the other thing you see that maybe kind of supports the argument I'm making is that it's always the second thing that's got the strong climax that ends how I'm breaking the sequence up, right? I mean, going to Wakanda is not a very strong sequence, right? Or climax. But
I don't know.
Shooting what's his name out the airlock is a bigger action oriented climax, right? I mean, it's a big victory.
Well, the end of that sequence specifically, when they're at Avengers compound, it does end with, we're in Wakanda. We get led into with the drums to Wakanda, and then we see the white
score.
Yeah,
great use of score.
Yeah, fuck yeah. And so I would argue that is I mean, like, granted, part of it would be like they would have to have the foresight to know that Black Panther would make over $1 billion 2 months prior to Infinity War coming out, which I don't know if they did. They probably had a good idea, like, okay, look, we're making a banger here, so we can tease up Wakanda before we get to Wakanda. So I think that is kind of I mean, it's a weird thing because it's like at the start of a new scene, new characters, but it is kind of like teeing up. I mean, I'm not arguing with you, but it's interesting.
No, I get what you're saying. Like, it's cool to go to Wakanda, but when we think about it from like plot goals and climaxes, like getting to Wakanda is not especially a big deal, but escaping the child of Thanos and rescuing Doctor Strange is a big deal from a plot perspective, right? I mean,
I think it just depends on what you're looking at as the goal. Like, I mean, because like if you zoom out, yes, both times they're trying to stop Thanos from getting the stones, essentially, whether it's Vision or Doctor Strange. But I do feel like there's a pretty distinct difference in the goals. Like, you know, they're worried about how to get the stone out of Vision's head, basically. How do we separate it so we can destroy the stone and keep Vision alive? And that's what they're all focused on. And then when we jump to space, we're all about how do we rescue Doctor Strange? Like, that's the goal, is rescue Doctor Strange. Get him, at least the immate goal is to,
but they get Strange out, whereas with Vision, it's just one part of a larger storyline. You know what I mean? Like that plot line with Cap and Vision is something, and also with Thor, both of those plot lines take a lot longer to
their movie level. They take up the whole.
Almost, or they're like act level, and then they're split up into pieces, right? Whereas, like when we go to Gamora, like they try to stop Gamora, or they try to stop Thanos from getting that stone. They fail. Thanos takes Gamora, right? And now that creates a new goal, which is, you know, to keep the Soul Stone from Thanos for Gamora, right? So those are very much, you know, for the most part, kind of very cordoned off and really have specific like goal to climax, whereas the goal of getting to Wakanda really doesn't matter. It's part of the broader goal of getting the stone out of Vision and destroying it before Thanos gets it, right? So it's just interesting the way some of the plot lines feel very segmented and other plot lines feel much longer, and then they have to be woven in, and that's what's really fascinating about this. And again, it's almost immaterial whether we agree or disagree that you know, the stuff with Cap at the headquarters and then the stuff with the spaceship, whether that's one sequence or two. What's interesting is how one of them is very action oriented and has, I think, a pretty strong climax, and the other one is setting up something that's going to climax later. You know, I mean, getting to Wakanda doesn't really accomplish anything in and of itself. It's a step towards something bigger, whereas killing that child of Thanos and rescuing Doctor Strange is a very strong goal in and of itself, right? And that's what's interesting, is the way the movie has to weave those two sets of things together.
Well, also one thing it's doing too is particularly at the end of the sequence of Avengers Compound into Wakanda. One thing they're doing too is that I guarantee, and maybe it was written that way, I could be wrong, but if it wasn't, then if they're in the editing room, they're like, okay, look, let's just say there's a chance that we're losing interest or something might be waning for the audience. So we're going to put that Wakanda scene could have happened at the start of the Wakanda scene. That could have happened, and then you could have cut to them flying to Wakanda, you know, like already almost there. But instead, they tagged it onto the end of the Avengers Compound. So it's like that scene that leads into this 30-second, not even 30-second, like 20-second scene between Chadwick and Sebastian Stan, kind of prepping up that for the future, right? So it does feel like they're always passing the torch and prepping the next thing over. Right. And I think a lot of that too is just they know their audience. They know people will be like, "Oh fuck, we're going to Wakanda. I can't wait till that next scene for Wakanda," because it's like they have multiple things in the back of their head. Like, okay, I'm dealing with this now, but I know Wakanda's coming up in a second. So I think it's super smart, and I think it does its job in terms of fan tailoring. You know, it's a fine line between making a movie and then also, like, you know, titillating us.
Right.
That's the right word.
Right. Yeah.
In some ways, this is the most fan service movie that there is. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, because like it does stand on its own as a movie if you haven't caught up, but like the amount that it increases in like significance and enjoyment if you're like a hardcore fan seems more than like any of the other MCU films to me. You know what I mean? Where it's like, yes, this is a great film, and if you're just going in for a popcorn blockbuster action flick, great. It's got that. But like if you're like into it, it's like triples in like what you get out of, or what kind of value you find in it.
The only contender for that would be Endgame, like in my opinion.
Sure, yeah, fair.
Yeah, and the only reason I wouldn't say it wins 100% is because it's not as tight as Infinity War. Like I love every second of Endgame. That movie emotionally destroyed me, and I love it because of that. But I can sit back and go, on a movie level, it's not as tight. It don't feel as it don't feel the same. But also it earns it. It's literally a almost conclusion or epilogue, so to speak.
Yeah.
Guys, we've hit the hour and almost 15-minute mark, and I think we're getting close to halfway. And then the next chunk of the movie is a lot of action, a lot of more kind of bursting through a little bit. I would love to pick this up in the next podcast for episode 100. Daniel, how can our listeners write into us?
Listeners, you can write into bit.ly/241mail. Let us know, is there anything we missed on this first half of the Infinity War saga movie? There's a lot of Infinity War named things, and it gets confusing. So, let us know, is there anything we missed? Anything you think we should have spent more time on? Or just give us your own thoughts on Infinity War. bit.ly/241mail.
And if you forgot, and I bet you didn't, we are sponsored by Kapow Comics, located at 4047 East Kill Avenue in Sherwood, Arkansas. There they have comic books, collectibles, graphic novels, and of course, special guest appearances throughout the year. Say it with us, Bruce.
Kapow.
There you go.
Yeah, I think.
And if you haven't, subscribe,
fix it in
give
post.
us a like on the YouTube channel. There you go, fix it in post. YouTube.com/Chickenwood Studios, the best place to consume the content. Of course, we're on all podcast services, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and many, many more. Thank you guys so much for doing this. Bruce, we will catch you up on the next episode. Really, no real-time change for us, but for you, viewer, you might have to wait just a little bit longer. Anyway, my name is Donovan Thompson.
I'm Daniel Wingfield.
And I'm Bruce Hutchinson.
And we have spoken.